Good night, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you in the last one of 4 online events organized by the Logistics League in partnership with the Logistics Center of Getúlio Vargas Foundation. I am Valentina Reis, student of the undergraduate course in Business Administration at FGV and member of the Logistics League. For those who are not familiar with the Logistics League, it is a students' organization with the goal of creating a connection between the academic and corporate world of logistics with students of FGV. For this, the League works to ensure opportunities for students to develop their skills and acquire practical and theoretical knowledge about logistics, whether through training, case studies, or contact with professionals in the field. Beginning by, I want to reaffirm that the statements expressed by the members of webinars of Getúlio Vargas Foundation represent exclusively the opinion of their authors and don't necessarily reflect the institutional position of FGV. And also that everyone present here agreed to take part in the event spontaneously and therefore authorize the transmission of their image in future recordings that will be available on FGV's channels. Today, this event seeks to deepen our studies in the theme ESG in logistics, in which our special guests will discuss how companies can implement environmental, social, and corporate governance in their organizational culture. So I'm pretty excited to introduce our guests today. We're here with Tanya Heck, who is Senior Regional Leader of Zoetis, who has extensive experience with end-to-end business and supply chain, and who is also an FGV student in the Master Business Administration of Supply Chain. And Professor Sanjay Lanka, who teaches managerial accounting on the One MBA at FGV with an ESG focus and professor of sustainability management at Kobe University. Our event today is split in 2 parts. First, our guests are presenting an introductory presentation about ESG and discussing the theme. And in the second part, they will be answering some of the audience questions. The viewers will be able to send their questions through the Slido platform. The access link is in the description of the video on YouTube. So welcome, Tanya and Sanjay. It's a pleasure to have you here. And Professor, please feel comfortable to start.
Great. Thank you very much, Valentina. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. So I'm just going to start things off by talking a little bit about what is ESG. So as you can see here, of course, everybody's heard these principles. But what we want to do is basically set up to why has this idea of environmental social governance within the context of a business become so important, right? So of course, the key thing that we're all talking about, or at least we were talking about recently, was the environmental part. So this is something that we're going to focus our discussion today. And we're going to tie this to the goals that many companies have to reach what we call the zero emissions. So we'll talk more about that. But here it's also important to tie this environmental part to looking at the impact that the supply chains have, right? And of course, we are going to talk about this in the context of what we call Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And then the very important aspect as well is the social aspect of ESG. Here we're talking about things like how are the employees treated? If you have suppliers in foreign countries, are their employees having safe working conditions? And all of the issues that relate to that, right? So here we're talking about the employee as well as the people aspect of ESG. And really the most important one, because to have good environmental social performance, what you need is a good corporate governance within the organization. And so really the foundation of good ESG is the G in the ESG, which is related to the governance of the organization, right? And so, of course, here in the context of companies, one of the laws that you should become aware of, and we can talk more about them later, is, of course, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the law from the United States, which talks about governance issues. And of course, in terms of ESG, the most important regulation that you should know about is the European Union regulation. And it's called the European Union Financial Reporting Regulation that was launched in the year 2019. So this makes it required for any business anywhere in the world that's doing business with the European Union, especially if you're exporting products from South America to the EU, you will need to now comply with these regulations. So let's move on. Thank you. So now the first question you might ask is, well, how do companies that want to comply with these regulations go about this process, right? So here is a very useful starting point for you. So let me introduce to you what we call the accounting standards, right? So these are the global reporting initiatives. So the GRI is the name of the organization that really started helping companies and businesses, various organizations, to start measuring their emissions of greenhouse gases. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are. But really, the key thing that you need to understand, tying to what I just talked about, is that there is a new organization that was launched at COP26 last year in Glasgow in 2021. And this organization is called the International Sustainability Standards Board. So this is about sustainability standards for a business. And these new standards are important to all of you because they're not voluntary standards, right? So every company has to comply with them. And these standards are being introduced by the IFRS, which, as many of us know, these are the standards which are the accounting standards around the world in all the countries in South America as well, right? So basically now companies will have to start reporting along with their financial performance what we were talking about as their environmental performance, their social performance as well, right? So how do companies do that? So these are the new standards. And of course, the GRI has been around for over 10 years now, and it's the most used standard. But the thing that's changed now since COP26 is that these are going to become a requirement for every company, right? So because we realize that climate change is a real issue, and so we have to mitigate climate change. So let's move on. Thank you, Tanya. So now that we're talking about climate change, so what is the relationship between ESG and what are these standards? So what is it that we have to measure, right? So here you can see that these are all the different sectors of the global economy. And as you can see that here you can see the percentage of emissions. So here we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. So the science behind it is coming to us from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what we call the IPCC. And actually just this month, the 6th report of the IPCC has been launched. And what this is telling us that unfortunately we are not right now on the target to meet our goals. So our goal in terms of the IPCC is to maintain or reduce actually the increase in temperatures, right? So we want to maintain the increase in global temperatures below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So unfortunately, right now we are on track to hit an increase of 3 degrees centigrade. So where do we make a change? So of course we have to change our system of using energy. So as you can see for electricity and heat production, which is the main, so 1/4 of our emissions are from that. But it's also important in the context of course, supply chain to look at what we call agriculture, forestry, and land use change, which is about 24%. So this is again for many companies in the agribusiness sector. But you can also see that transportation, which is where we're talking about the supply chain and logistics part, is also pretty significant, right? Of course, it's not the top 2 or the top 3, but it does have a role to play. Thank you, Tanya. So now let's talk about what is the science behind how do we measure these things, right? So I did mention briefly scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So let me take an example of a business. So let's say we're going to be talking about some of these companies in more detail, right? So we know the company like JBS, for example, that is in the food production business. So in that case of JBS, so the factories where they convert the meat into products that we can consume, so these would be their facilities, right? And they would also have their own company cars, which are, being used for the organization itself, right? So this is company cars and vehicles, so trucks, transportation within the supply chain, but internal to the company, right? So all of those the company can measure, and these are called Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are emissions related to the energy that the business uses, which it will not produce itself, right? So let's say JBS buys electricity from the national electricity grid in Brazil. So a lot of this energy is very clean, but of course it has to buy it and it has to use that. And so that is what we call Scope 2 emissions. Now, most companies, and so far the rules and regulations around the world where we talk about emission reduction has only focused on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Now, I'll tell you about another important change that has happened. So the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is, of course, the US regulatory organization, it's the organization that supervises the stock markets in the US, right? So the NASDAQ, the US stock markets. And so they have mandated last week that now companies will also have to start reporting what we will call Scope 3 emissions. So it's important for you to understand that over 70% of a company's emissions are actually Scope 3. So far, companies haven't had to account for them or report them in their financial statements. So I think it's really important that you understand that going forward, so we're expecting from 2023, all companies that are listed on the US markets will have to do it. So an example is JBS, right? So JBS has a subsidiary called Pilgrim's Pride, which is a US listed company, right? So JBS's subsidiary in the US, because it's listed on the US stock market, will have to start reporting its Scope 3 emissions, right? So this is just to give you an example. So now let's understand what are Scope 3 emissions. So these are, again, the emissions that are produced in the first part, and then, when you're supplying your product to your customer. So one more thing I want to mention, because you might say, how do companies reduce their emissions? So really the big change that we're seeing is, as you can see here, this is the map of the world showing where the rare earth metals are located. So what are these rare earth metals? They are the metals that are used in all of the electric cars and all of the technology that we're changing, right? So from wind farms to solar panels. So all of the changes that companies have to make, it's also very important. So again, here you can see the supply chain of this is very important, right? So again, from a supply chain point of view, you have to understand that even today, almost 90% of these metals are being sourced only from China. So of course, there is potential in the United States to increase the production. But as you can see, there's very few countries in the world that have these resources, right? So again, this is something that's going to be related to emissions, but also what we call the risk. So again, very important aspect of ESG is the risk that's in your supply chain, right? So now, because of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, all of these things are becoming more complicated. Obviously, we are not going to be buying anything from Russia, for example, right? So then that removes that supply from the global market. Thank you. And again, we're talking about risk. So again, in the Brazilian context, or even in the South American context, you can see that in the the environmental risk is the fact that we have a lot of deforestation that's happened in the Amazon. And the concerning sign, of course, you can see is that the last few years, this has gone up, right? So again, this is where I think it's important to talk about in the context of the agribusiness sector, which potentially has risk because of this deforestation. And this risk is what we call reputational risk, right? So if you have a brand that's well known and people are buying it, but suddenly if that brand gets associated with deforestation, the evidence is showing that consumers today are very, for them, it's very important, the sustainability of the brands that they buy. And we'll talk more about that in more detail. Thank you. So again, coming back to the risk issues and overall the economy and supply chain, what I want to show you here is something very interesting, which is, of course, we all know that Brazil has been doing very well. It's one of the top producers in many commodities, especially coffee, soya, as well as beef. We just talked about JBS. So here you can see that the basis of this growth has been phenomenal increase in the yields of agricultural production in Brazil. And that's the top line that you see. And it's increased. Also, the area of production hasn't increased so much, but you can see the production itself has gone up. Now, what I want you to understand here, and the point I want to make, is that we just talked about the war in Ukraine. We just talked about all of these supply chain issues, the cost of energy going up. So one of the biggest risks, and this is again something that I think you will need to understand as the key point in the context of ESG, is the risk related to being able to deliver the products within your supply chains, right? So what are some of those risks? So let me just illustrate the primary one that we're seeing because of the war in Ukraine, which is related to the lack of availability of fertilizers and also the increase in the cost of oil, which is a raw material in fertilizer production, right? So these are, again, just to give you an illustration, around the world, the cost of fertilizer has doubled in 2021, right? And of course, in the past month, since the war in Ukraine has started, the price of oil has gone up significantly, right? So these are, again, risks that you will need to think about if you are managing the logistics supply chain. Because remember, in the logistics supply chain, it's not only delivering products to the customer, which is what we call the downstream, it's also where you're able to access the raw materials that you need, right? So again, these are some significant risks that we're seeing in the year 2022 and potentially down the road, unless, of course, this all gets resolved. Thank you. So another big risk, and this is related to the deforestation, is the relation of deforestation to what we call climate change, right? So what we're seeing in the Brazilian case, and this is not something that we're talking about in the future, this is a good example of an event that happened in 2021, right? So in 2021, Brazil has had the worst drought in about 90 years. And so here you can see the impact of this drought being really bad in the southern part of Brazil, but it's pretty significant across Brazil. So just to give you an example, in coffee, the production of Brazilian coffee is down about 30% compared to the previous years, right? So obviously this has an impact on the global market for coffee, on the availability of coffee, on the price of coffee. And of course, if you are the Brazilian company whose production is down, obviously you need to make sure that you can supply your customers, right? So again, here are some of the issues that we talk about within the ESG context, right? Because these issues are not just issues that you want to do because you're a good person. These are actual risks that will have a financial impact on the business, right? So, and this is why institutional investors are paying a lot of attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tandai. Thank you for the explanation. So it's very important to think about all these risks that the companies are facing regarding the climate change. It's very important to think how to compete in such a global environment so that the companies are playing such a special role on this. So, and here, let's talk about a little bit, how are the companies preparing for this? So here I brought some examples regarding Brazilian companies that are playing such important role in the global market. So as Professor said, JBS, so now they are having a lot of programs regarding ESG and regarding sustainability in order to be carbon neutral by 2040. In the same way, we are talking about BRF. So a Brazilian company here specialized for food. So how they will be carbon neutral by 2040. And here we can see another example regarding Vale. It's a mining company here in Brazil, very important company for us, but this company faced a few years ago such important disaster, natural disaster that impacted the reputation of Vale. And here, another very important company, Suzano, for paper. So they have such a big ambitions in order to reduce the carbon here by 2025. All these companies here in Brazil, they have a very important role. Why? Because they are playing in a global trade. They need to report the way that they produce their products. So, and also the whole network, the whole supply chain. And it's very important to track and see each step of their production, not only the production itself, as Professor said, but also the full scenario, the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. We are talking about the full scenario regarding that, the upstream and also the downstream on this channel. Moving here, the next slide, I can say, and we can discuss a little bit about what means being neutral. What is net zero? Net zero here is to reducing or removing all value chain greenhouse gas emissions to help limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. So in accordance with the 2015 Paris Agreement. So here, all the companies have a very important role in order to have this compromise in order to be carbon neutral. So, and how they can calculate this, how companies must calculate the carbon footprint. First, it's very important to do the inventory of the greenhouse gas emissions, to know what are the emissions, not only regarding the productions, but the whole scenario, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, in order to see their emissions and in order to find some way in order to reduce a lot of gas emissions, so in the whole chain, in order to reach the balance of these emissions. But we know that many companies, they can neutralize these emissions, not only reduce their productions itself or their supply chain network, but find some ways to buy carbon credits on the market as well. So this is a very topic to discuss, and nowadays are becoming more and more a high-level topic for all the CEOs.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Tanya, because just to talk a little bit about the offset market. So the offsets are traded in the European market, and they're also traded now in China. So China is the newest carbon market. So a company can go and buy these offsets. So if it's not able to reduce its emissions, you have to either grow plants or trees, which is what we call carbon sequestration. So the trees are actually taking out the carbon dioxide, right? And if you can't do that, then you can go to the markets in the European Union or in China or in the UK, which are the only places that we have these markets now. So I think that's something as well for companies to think about.
Yes, very important point. And here, so talking about some examples regarding the sustainability strategy. So, and here I brought one example regarding the consumer packaged goods. So all the consumer goods can do. This is what the research made by BCG, Boston Consulting Group, so regarding sustainability. And here some initiatives, some examples that we can have in the companies that we are working on in order to have this topic of sustainability even more a kind of daily activities. So, and now, so we can see that this concept of sustainability starts since from the product development. So thinking about the packaging, thinking about the life cycle of the product, so how we can use and how the consumers can dispose of this product as well, to think about the whole scenario. So also enhance the sustainability with the suppliers to have their accountability as well in order to put in place a lot of activities in order to provide the companies a more sustainable products and material as well, in work with collaboration with them. And also talk about increased efficiencies and use of operational resources such as water, such as avoid the waste of the production and other types of how we can optimize the productions, the product transformation in the company. And talk about here this in the supply chain side, optimize the supply chain network. So how we can play a very important game here in order to have more optimize deliveries in order to reduce the inefficiencies in our supply chain. And I can give you a lot of examples of that. We are not just talking about electric vehicles, but how we can reduce the inefficiencies, use less air freight, or how we can optimize the deliveries, how we can avoid the idle capacity in the vehicles, and so on. And also to adopt more a circular economy, so circular models, to reuse all the packagings, the materials that we use to deliver to the customers, such as pallets, such as styrofoam cases, ice packs, and so on. So nowadays, we know that in order to reuse these materials, it costs a lot. How we can collaborate and work with other players or cooperatives. So in order to provide this kind of reusable products for some companies, try to think about this process as well. And in the same way that BCG made this survey, they also asked it to the group of the people that respond this question if they are thinking about sustainability, they are willing to pay at least 5% more for the products with a more sustainable ways. So it's very important that nowadays the consumers, the customers, they want to have more visibility what they are buying. It's a very important thing, and the companies as well. So as Professor Sanjay said, so for investors, for the companies, in order to play a very important game in the market, you need to have more visibility about all your supply chain. And here, so the last slide, I'd like to challenge you a little bit and to ask you what you are doing as a logistics professional regarding sustainability, because we know that we have a lot of inefficiencies in our chain regarding the flow of materials, using vehicles with idle capacity. So we have a lot of refusals and returns products. How are we going to do with this? How to optimize even more the reverse logistics? And the last piece is how we can reuse boxes, pallets, ice packs, and other types of material. We know that it's much cheaper to buy new ones instead of to reuse these ones. But in the same way, we need to think even more about, okay, what we can do and what we can play with our customers as well in order to provide and in order to make the advantage to reuse this in order to the customers see the benefits of that. So Martina, this is what we have for our discussion nowadays. So let's see here if we have questions, and let's start.
Okay, thank you, Tanya and Sanjay, for such a complete and didactic exposition of the theme. So now we're heading to the audience question session. I have here 3 questions. First, how can multinational companies deal with different regulations in different countries?
Okay, so maybe I can answer that. So I guess the short answer to that is actually we're not seeing different regulations in different countries. What we're seeing is we're seeing kind of a common standard that's coming up. So just for those of you who don't have a background in accounting, we have what we call common regulation for accounting as well, right? So really the global standard is called the IFRS, which is the standard in Colombia, in Brazil, and most of the European Union. So what we're really seeing is that because the many businesses, many multinationals have complained, why do we have like a multiple choice test of which standard to use, right? So we have many different, so that was the problem. So the good news, as I said, is that we have this new standards that's created by the IFRS called the ISSB, right? So you can see it's called the International Sustainability Standards Board. And so now the ISSB is going to make the standards for everybody, right? So the supply chain, doesn't matter which country you're located in, you are going to apply the same standards, right? So then you cannot say or complain that, hey, my country, the standards are more difficult. So the idea is to create what we call a level playing field, right? So all companies can compete and everybody has to meet the same standards, right? So in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of making sure there are no human rights issues within the supply chain, in terms of social, and of course, very important is the issue of corruption and bribery and things like that, right?
Perfect. Tanya?
Yes, thank you, Sanjay. Yes, nowadays, so all the visibility regarding the companies, especially the international ones, became more, we have more visibility about the production, about all the activities that the companies are doing. For example, we know nowadays that the reputation is very important for the companies. So, for example, few years ago, we saw some very, how can I say, important information regarding the Nike production, regarding their suppliers are using a child labor, so was very bad for Nike, and they put in place a lot of regulations, a lot of, how can I say, restrictions, conditions with their suppliers in order to avoid this kind of activities. I think more and more the companies are worried about that, and of course the international ones, they have such strict regulations because they have the stock market, and these kind of things needs to be very clear for the investors and so on. For the national companies, so the governments and the other companies here, they are putting in place a lot of regulations as well. As I mentioned before, we have such a very powerful companies here in Brazil, and they are very worried about that, and they are putting in place a lot of regulations, a lot of things in compliance in order to play this important role. So I think more and more the companies are aware of this, so, and they are trying to reach their targets as well. Of course, there are way in order to achieve so the good results, the targets, but as well as the consumers, they want the visibility what they are buying. I think this kind of mentality that we are seeing the customers nowadays is very important as well.
Perfect. So we're heading to the next one. With all the instability we are experiencing in Brazil, including this election year, do you think the country will be able to fulfill its ESG agenda? What's the correlation between the current government and the sustainable performance of companies?
Wow, it's a very good question.
Do you want to go ahead first, Tanya? Please do.
Yes, I will first and you can complement. Yes, I think, yes, the companies are aware that they are not depend on only for the government in order to put in place all the activities and all the things regarding the sustainability agenda. So we know that we are advancing in the last years with deforestation in Amazon, but the companies are aware of that, and they are looking for suppliers that have a better production way in order to avoid these kind of things. So I can tell you about the livestock production nowadays, because we know that in order to do these activities, so we need the land in order to produce, in order to have the cattle, in order to have the animals and so on. But so the companies are aware that this way that we had in the past is not the same way that we're going to have in the future. We need to have a more sustainable way in order to protect our forests and avoid this. So the companies are aware of that even more, and I think the consumers as well. So, and there is no, how can I say, not only the regulations and laws that the government needs to implement in order to have this kind of attitude, but also they can play the game, so the companies can play this game. of course, the government has a very important role on that in order to control, in order to put in place and this kind of regulation as well. So these kind of things that I think we need to see even more for the governments that will come. So not only this, but of course the continuity of these regulations in these programs, so that we need to develop. So I think that we need to continue to have the programs in order to have more sustainable programs in our country.
Great. And I think that's great, Tanya, because I'm glad you covered the perspective of the companies, but I think I can try and answer maybe the broader question about the instability, right? So of course, we don't know what the election is going to bring. That's the instability part. But I think what we know for sure is that we still have these supply chain risks that we're talking about, right? So I think it's important to look at, for example, kind of focusing maybe on the livestock, because remember, for the livestock, we also need the soya, right? Because we feed the livestock the soya. And again, this is where the risk element and the reputation risk is also for the soya companies, because they are not only the Amazon, but I think the region around the Cerrado region that we all know is where the soya is being produced, right? So the fact that this is happening, obviously you could say, is there enough money being invested by the government in the agencies that are supposed to protect the Amazon and protect the Cerrado and protect the Pantanal, right? So unfortunately, the evidence that we have now from the international reporting that's being done is that maybe the government hasn't focused on that. So I think that is left to the people of Brazil, if that's an important issue for them, right? Because what are they going to decide to vote on, right? So again, just like I think Tanya's made an excellent point, the consumer now wants to see sustainability. But it's not just the wealthy consumer. I think it's also the consumer, the middle-class consumer in the emerging markets. And that's the million-dollar question, because sometimes, you know, what we in the emerging markets want is different from what the wealthy consumer wants in places like Sweden or Norway or, you know, Germany, for example, right? So I think that's an issue where we have to ask the question, how are you going to vote? What are the things that you are thinking about, right? So here it's also an issue of what is the information that's in the public discussion? Are people talking today about climate change when they're talking about the election? I don't know, right? So I think this is also where really the question is, again, going back to the students who are asking the question, are you talking about these issues when you say, hey, you know, which party is doing the right thing, right? So I think it's really an important question about our public debate, about the role of democracy and, you know, how we can have those open conversations. And of course, fortunately, we are doing that now, right? So I think we need to have, of course, our focus today is on the supply chain and the risks around it. And definitely the biggest risk to this for all companies is what we call the political risk, right? So because we don't know what the policies will be, we don't know how they will change, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it is something that I think we will only know in October, hopefully, right? But so I think the challenge therefore is, how do companies plan for that? And I think all the things that Tanya talking about is very important, right? Because companies have to plan for things irrespective of what happens.
Exactly. And building on your point, Sanjay, I think it's very important to mention that Brazil has a very important role in the agriculture part, in the agriculture business. And we know that the majority of our business here in the agriculture part is very important for the country. And we know that there are a lot of natural extraction, natural resource extraction that we have nowadays, such as mining and so on. So it's very important to think about the future. So the companies are aware that the way that they are doing nowadays in order to extract natural resource, maybe in the future, so they will be very limited. So they are think about, okay, so how I will protect my business in order to guarantee this kind of business continuity.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tanya. Go ahead, Valentina, if you have another question.
Perfect. I have another question here, which is kind of related. So What is the government's role in ensuring that companies are sustainable? What else can it do besides regulation and oversight?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question. And I think the role of the government is regulation and oversight, but it's also potentially also working with companies, right? So I don't want us to think that the role of government is only like the police, right? Because I think, and I have been fortunate to spend some time in Brasilia talking to people in the agriculture ministry, for example. And I think it's great that you have wonderful people in the ministry who are actually thinking ahead about what are the challenges, right? So this is the kind of conversation we have. For example, we are looking at international trade. So for example, if there is a more demand for soya, the role of the government is to work with the companies to say, hey, you know what, there is going to be more demand. So can we work together to make sure that Brazil is able to produce these things, but also keeping in mind the ESG criteria, right? So I think it's not just about being regulations. And I can assure you, we have done some courses at FGV where we're working on partnerships between companies in Brazil and India, for example, right? So it's important to understand that Brazil imports a lot of its fertilizer from India, and India imports a lot of its soy oil from Brazil, right? So these kinds of what we call trade linkages is where I can assure you the people in the government departments and ministries are very happy to do that, right? But again, this is also where I think we've done our role as I guess professors. Obviously I'm from India, I work in Brazil. So, we are doing our best as well to connect the businesses from Brazil with businesses from India, right? So again, this is just one example. Similarly, you have good relations with companies from China importing a lot of products from Brazil, right? So in this kind of mix, it's not just about the role of the government is not only about regulation, but the role of the government is also to build proper diplomatic relations, create, a situation where trade can happen, right? So I'm happy to report, for example, we just had a delegation from Brazil go to India. They're there right now. And so hopefully there will be more opportunities, right? So, and of course, last semester we organized the immersion course where we had CEOs from Brazil and India coming and talking to our students. Hopefully some of your students were in that course, and we will continue to do that, right? So I think this is also very important, that let's not put the blame on the government, because the government does a lot of things. And really there, it's about the companies working with the government, not treating them as, oh, they're just giving us regulation, we have to deal with it. It's really a partnership, right? Because we have to develop our economy, but we also have to do it in a way that is sustainable, right?
Yes, it's a very important point, Sanjay, that you brought here, because yes, the government have a very important role on that, but also the companies nowadays, they are playing in a global market. We are not only here, so we are seeing that the war in Ukraine right now are impacting here all our agriculture economy as well, and other types of economies, so other types of sectors as well. And now we are seeing that the petrol, the gas, so are increased, so we have this kind of impact. I think the important role of the government is trying to engage other governments, other countries, and make this kind of partnership with them. So in order to engage them, how we can compete in a global trade, so how we can offer Brazilian products, and on the same way with, and how we can have different types of products here in Brazil. I think this is very important, that the government can support the companies here. So all the sustainability, all the regulations, and these kind of things, I think even more the companies are preparing, so this environment, this space for that. But of course, we need to have this kind of relationship to open for the market.
Very nice. I have a next question here. I think it will be a piece of cake for you. How do carbon credits work?
All right, excellent. Well, I'm happy to answer that because, of course, we teach that in one of our courses, right? So we can I can give you an idea. So the idea of carbon markets, of course, is the idea, again, coming, as Tanya mentioned, it's coming out of the the Paris Accord of 2015. So the idea that we have to reduce our emissions, right? So there is actually a limit that's put on companies that are producing the emissions. So really you start off with what we call the baseline, right? So for example, let's say we have a company like JBS and it's producing 100% of its emissions in 2021. And of course, let's say it needs to reduce its emissions by 40% over the next, let's say 18 years, right? So its goal is to become net zero by 2040. So what we're looking at in terms of carbon markets is that there are two ways that JBS can participate in the carbon market, right? So JBS could invest in technology and innovation to reduce its emissions. And what it would do then is, by reducing its emission, it's able to obviously meet its goal, right? So of course, this requires a lot of investment in technology, and there's a lot of need for what we call capital expenditures, right? Now, the less expensive way to do this is, of course, the carbon offset, right? So what that is where JBS could, let's say, partner with Suzano. For example, Suzano has a lot of forest, and JBS could say, hey, Suzano, we will buy the carbon credits from, your forest, and, we will use that to reduce our goal of emissions, right? So these are, again, I'm just giving examples. I hope Suzano and JBS take this idea from me and work together if they're not already, right? So this is how you can create a way to reduce the carbon impact. So what happens is, of course, here you can work directly with Suzano, or if I'm a company in, let's say, France, and my name is Danone, and what I can do, in fact, that's what I did my PhD on. Danone came to India and they planted 6 million trees. And so then that production of those trees went to the farmers, but the carbon credits that those trees generated were given to Danone, right? So then Danone took the carbon credits. So we planted 6 million trees, just to give you an example. So the carbon sequestration of those 6 million trees is what then Danone is able to trade in the carbon market in the European Union, right? So again, these are examples. I'm sure many like JBS could do the same, right? So there are deforested lands potentially that it could convert into agroforestry again, right? So of course, the key thing to understand is you cannot, in the international markets, you cannot take credit for existing forests. If you have a piece of land that was destroyed and degraded and there's nothing there, then if you start with from zero, and let's say like we did, we planted 6 million trees in a land that was degraded. So that means that's a bonus, right? So you're adding to the greenhouse gas sequestration of the trees in the world. So that's really how a carbon market works. I'm happy to explain further if needed. But again, it's a huge topic. We can talk about it for hours.
Very didactic, Professor. Thank you.
Yes, I think, yes, Professor said everything here. So very interesting point here. So my only comment here is, so the companies now, I think we have a big future for the carbon credits. So this market, I think, will be very important for the companies, how they will invest and how they will find this carbon neutral. So to be neutral, I think it's very important for all the companies. So in order to achieve the targets, and very important topic, because even more, in order to maintain, to have the business continuity, we need to think about this.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Tanya. I have here a question from Renata Garcia Lima, and she wants to know about the interdependence between ESG, management of integrity, risks and compliance, and sustainable logistics plan, and SDOs.
That's a very good question, Renata. Thank you for that. And actually, that helps us to kind of tie together all the things we've talked about, right? Because I think what you're talking about first is not just the greenhouse gas emission part, but what is your supply chain, right? So I'm sure Tanya can talk more about the part of how companies plan and look to improve the supply chain. But maybe what I can start off with is, so many automotive companies are factoring electric cars, right? So, okay, so I think maybe that's the next question. Sorry. I'm going to stick to this one. So really what we're looking at is in terms of ESG, what companies are now trying to do is develop, as we talk about in management control systems, right? So that means a business has to change its whole operation. So if you are going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, that's not something like saying, oh, I'm going to reduce it by 5%. You're talking about becoming zero in about 20 years, right? So this is really where the engineering comes in, right? Along with the supply chain, because the engineering is where you have to see how you're making everything you're making. And really the laws of thermodynamics help us understand how you can reduce energy use, right? So, and that's something that unfortunately we don't teach in business schools, but this is also where in the work that I'm doing, we're finding that this is where the business people and the engineering people in the company have to work together, right? So usually companies have engineers who understand energy, right? But now the engineers have to work with the accountants, because the accountants are now coming with the new rules telling them, hey, sorry, you can't do this anymore. You're producing too many greenhouse gas emissions, right? So I think this is the part, and again, I've done this work myself, being an engineer and an accountant. So I'm usually the one who brings the engineers and the accountants together, because we usually don't agree, right? So it's very difficult. So you have to have what we call interdisciplinary skills, right? People who are good at different things. And I think this is an opportunity as well for companies to therefore find that diversity in their organization and make sure that you have these different people with different skill sets coming together, right? Because this is not a solution that's just someone with supply chain. You also need someone with accounting, knowledge of what we call the environmental costs, ideas of climate change. And then, of course, you need the engineers who can tell you, well, what is it going to cost to develop this new technology that's going to reduce our emissions, right? But then you also need the finance people to agree to that, right? Because what's the impact on profitability, right? So this is not a simple thing. But anyway, the good news is I'm already having these conversations in some companies. And in fact, there are also standards, right? So to give you an example, there is something called the B Corp, which is a type of corporation which is actually not only doing these changes, but to become a B Corp, you have to actually document and show how you have transformed your whole business organization to be more sustainable, right? So again, I know B Corp is quite popular in Brazil as well, but it's really, to me, the starting point, because within the B Corp, you can also get help from your competition, right? So imagine JBS working with BRF together to see how they can improve supply chain in the livestock sector, right? So I think those are the ways we need to go. Collaboration, because competition is not really the way to go here, right? Because we all need to save the planet. It's the only one we have.
And just to complement here regarding the sustainability, the compliance, and all this kind of information that we have nowadays and that we share regarding ESG, GRE, and so on. So it's all interconnected, because we need to have the information. So now, even more, we are measuring our greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to have this kind of inventory. So, and in order to validate and audit this information, so we need a compliance piece. We need a compliance system in order to support the companies to do that. And this, in the same way, all these activities and projects that companies are working on regarding sustainability is very important. So not only in the production side, but the upstream and downstream is very important as well. So how we can map this and how we can work with your suppliers, your customers, when you were talking about the end-to-end of supply chain, in order to have this kind of sustainable way. So, and we are talking about here sustainable logistics plan. So we are talking about using less of trucks, vehicles, so all these kind of containers that we are seeing nowadays, so how we can optimize this, and also to think about the waste, the disposal product. This is very important as well for the companies. Nowadays, a lot of companies don't have a process for a disposal products. So, and we can see, so companies work on that. So we saw in last year, so a huge problem regarding the issues that we had with the tires, the companies in the automotive industry as well, in order how they will dispose of their products. So all these kind of things are interconnected. So in the last piece here, that the question from Renata regarding the, I think is the DSO, so the development objectives of sustainability from ONU. So it's totally connected with ESG as well. We are talking about the community, we are talking about society, so we are talking about the diversity as well. So all these kind of objectives are interconnected, not only with the companies, but also with the countries, with the society. I think it's very important.
Thank you, Tanya. Very complete. So the next question is from Anonymous, and he wants to know, many automotive companies in the USA and Europe are factoring electric cars. Are there terms of reverse logistic and environmental for it yet?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, I think, because I think that's a question that, see, right now we're in what we would call the early stage of the rise of electric cars, right? So again, this is what we call life cycle for a product. So because it's such a new product, I think we're still in the early stages. Of course, here where I'm sitting in the US, we have a lot of Teslas now, right? So the electric car is basically the Tesla, but there are a lot of competitors as well. And so the challenge, I think, is to create what I think Tanya was talking about, the life cycle. Right? So, because once you finish using your electric battery, so what happens to it? So I think this is what is going to be the biggest kind of disruption in the market, because another challenge that we're seeing, some companies, what they're trying to do is let's say you're driving down the highway, you cannot stop and recharge your battery, right? Well, now Tesla can recharge you in 5 minutes to 70%. But another option is to basically take out your battery and put a new one in. Right? So the part that I think the question is about, well, what happens when the battery doesn't work anymore, right? So this is also what we're seeing with cell phone companies, right? So Apple, for example, if you buy a new Apple, it will take your old phone and give you something, $30 for it, because that's what I think the point Tanya is making is the life cycle, right? So the owners of these batteries shouldn't throw them in the trash because they're not very clean, right? The environmental cost of those batteries is huge. So I think these are things that we are not yet seeing because all the cars on the market are very new, right? So it's only been in the last 5 years that Teslas are on the road. So I think, but it's a good question because I'm still waiting to hear what is the plan. Like, so the reverse logistics, the cost of, making sure that all of this doesn't become waste. So all the points that Tanya is making, I think, are really pronounced in the case of electric cars. And again, this is where I want to bring us back to the slide about the, dependence on China, right? So all of those metals are inside those batteries, right? So really, we don't want to throw them away. You want to completely recycle, right? So because obviously, I don't want to give bad news, but if there is some problem accessing these parts from China in the future, then what's going to happen? Right? We will have to make do with what we have, right? So I think this is going to be where we will see hopefully innovation, maybe new companies that will need to be created for the sole purpose of making sure those life cycle costs are managed, right? So there's room for innovation always.
Yes, it's a very good point, Sanjay, and thanks for the question here. So few years ago, so I don't know if you are aware, but we have a lot of electric cars in Paris. So a lot of electric cars in Paris. And the problem was the battery, how they can recharge the battery, and also the life cycle of the battery as well, how we can dispose of this battery. Nowadays, so they are facing a huge problem regarding the electric vehicles in Paris, because we don't have all the infrastructure yet in order to dispose this product, and how we can recharge again these batteries, so how we can change this. And in terms of electric vehicle, so of course, some countries in Europe and also in US, we have more infrastructure in order to use the electric cars, but here in Brazil, it's a challenge for electric cars because we don't have all the infrastructure yet. And of course, there is no carbon emission, but we need to think about the electricity as well, because we are using electricity. So we need to have this kind of mentality. Yes, it's very important to use electric vehicle because we don't have carbon emission, but on the other way, so we are using electricity and we don't have the infrastructure yet. And of course, the reverse logistics regarding batteries, so it's a bottleneck nowadays. So we need to try to find a ways to solve these issues.
Perfect. We don't have any more questions. So Sanjay, Tanya, would you like to add any comment?
No, thank you very much, Valentina, for hosting us, for doing all the work to organize the event. And Tanya, a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for the opportunity to have the conversation as well.
Thank you so much, Valentina and Professor Sanjay. Very good discussions with you. So thanks a lot for today and for the invite.
Yes, thank you.
So if we don't have any more questions, this is the end of the webinar. It was a great conversation, and I would like to thank you, Tanya and Sanjay, for participating and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Your speeches were very complete, and I'm sure everyone who attended this webinar now has a different understanding of ESG and logistics. I also want to thank FGVcelog for helping us to organize the event, and everyone who participated, watched, and sent their questions. Finally, I invite everyone to follow us on social media and watch the other webinars about logistics on FGV's YouTube. Good night, everyone, and have a great week.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.